It is the World Cup. It is to a front. We are a week and a bit into the World Cup, and there's so many things to talk about. We've seen upsets, we've seen high scores, we've seen goalless draws. But first up, Chuck, what are we talking about today?
We're going to look at comments made by the Ghanaian coach, Otto Addo. And he says that, and I'll read the quote in particular, that because Africa only has four participants in the World Cup, chances of them making it far in the group is limited because of that fact. And therefore, we're always looking for Africa to do a lot. And if you're asking for those four teams to go through to the quarters and to the semis or actually win it, how many teams does Europe have? How many teams does South America have? So he was saying that the odds are not stacked in Africa's favor. So here's the actual quote. He says, "There was never a point where everybody had an equal chance at the start. Never in FIFA history. It's very, very difficult if you have 5 slots to get far. If you have 12 or 14 slots, I don't know how many Europe get, the probability that a team will get further is much, much higher." So he's basically saying it's a numbers game. He's pointing out that if Germany flop, there's Spain. If Spain flop, there's Italy. If Italy flops, there's France. If France flops, there's England. Whereas with us, it's just 5 teams. And amongst those 5, there's the best and the worst, whereas they get a larger number in which you can categorize more than 5 teams who are actually strong. So do you think he's got a point? Do you think if there were more African teams at the World Cup, Africa will go further? Or is it just a matter of our level, that no matter how many African teams you pack in there, we'll still do what we're doing now currently?
So purely on mathematics, of course, if you have more teams from the region, the chances are that one goes further. Well, and with regards to other continents getting more teams, that's only true of Europe, because CONCACAF have as many, CONMEBOL have as many. I think CONCACAF is like 4 teams, and then South America also has 5 teams, as much as Africa. And they've produced champions, even with that limited number. There's never been a time where they had 10 or they had more than what they have now. But if you go with that relative to how many teams are on that particular, how many countries are on that particular continent, that's a lot of their teams versus there are 52, if I'm not mistaken, states in Africa, and all of us play football. But I think it's a matter of what is the quality of the teams that you'd be sending to the World Cup. If you look at the teams that have missed out, then you are supposed to be able to make an argument that if one of those teams were there, then that's a strong enough team whereby they would trouble the teams from the other continents, and therefore Africa would have another viable challenger. And from where I'm sitting, I think maybe you can make an argument for Nigeria, just based on the players that are available to them, based on the players who play in Europe. Those high quality players. But the thing is, if they were good enough, they were going to be able to make it past Ghana, which they didn't. Similar thing to Egypt. Egypt made it all the way to the AFCON final against Senegal, and then they had the luck of the draw that didn't go their way, whereby they faced Senegal again. And you may want to make the argument as well there that if Mo Salah and his teammates were at the World Cup, perhaps they make noise when they're there. So you could make that argument, but the other argument is if they were already good enough, they would be there. But of course, if it's strength versus strength, then someone is missing out. Who perhaps if they were playing against a lesser team from Africa, then they make it to the World Cup, and they do as well as we've seen some of the African countries do most recently. So I'm a bit up in the air with that. I think if the teams in this particular World Cup, or African teams, if you have 2 teams at least go to the round of 16, one of them to the quarters, or maybe even the semis, then you have a very credible argument. But if it's a matter of, well, we just want numbers, and the numbers that you have now have not actually indicated that, well, this is a strong base for football, and you justifiably give them more numbers at the World Cup, and you will see them doing just as well as, again, as I'm saying, teams from Europe, because everybody else has as many or less teams at the World Cup than Africa does.
So I think he's actually got a point. I lean towards agreeing with him, because if you think about it, Ghana went past Bafana, went past Nigeria to get to the World Cup. We will cry foul and say that we were robbed in one of those games.
Which we were.
Ghana. I think in the game against Ghana and Nigeria, there was only 1 goal in it, and they won via away goals. There wasn't much between those two sides. Egypt is a strong side as well. So I'm not saying that we are necessarily top three of the rest who didn't make it, but if we add Bafana, if we add Nigeria, and we add Egypt, I think we're well with the chance to have an upset in the World Cup. If you look at how Japan upset Germany, if you look at how Saudi Arabia upset Argentina, all we need is an upset, basically, and then you draw your other two games and you're through. And if it's a numbers game, Jay, if you think about it, if Portugal is in a group with Luxembourg and Germany are playing Faroe Islands or wherever, you are guaranteed to get your big guns through. I mean, Lento Netherlands in the past couple of tournaments, what's happened to Italy now, that's an anomaly. Those things don't particularly happen because they always are playing against minnows and they make it through. But if you've got the gauntlet as Ghana to play against Bafana, and then you play against Nigeria, who are powerhouses that you could have had with you in the World Cup, just to make it to the World Cup, I think you're cutting your best sides because Nakona, sometimes it's about form, sometimes it's about the players, as you say now. They might not be particularly that strong right now to say, okay, these sides are so strong that if they got the chance to beat such and such. But you have teams like Belgium, who aren't really up to par, but they made it to the World Cup. And so if they were playing a lesser nation, if they played the Madagascars, the Lesothos, the Botswanas more often, and made it just because they were in a bigger group, I think that makes more sense in terms of we've got more credible teams that are at the World Cup. So I tend to agree with what he's saying, and I do know that Africa is not the strongest it's not the strongest continent in terms of developing footballing sides, but if Ghana can win and score 3 for the first time, if Cameroon can draw with Serbia and score 3 as well for the first time, there is an improvement. But how many teams are improving if you only get to see 4 or 5 at a time? So for me, I think he's got a clear point.
So you saying that Africa should have as many teams as Europe on the basis that?
Not as many as Europe. I think if we cut it down to a matter of 8 each or whatever. And look, I know.
Oh, you're saying take numbers away from Europe?
Yeah, because Abanya qualified because they are like the 9th best. You know, like how Portugal had a back window and Italy almost went through by another back window. I know Ghana did the very same thing, but what I'm saying is if they're going through the back window to be team number 12 and team number 13, I think it's taking away spots from teams who could do something because at the end of the day, it's a world game. And yes, you want to see the powerhouses. You worry about the quality of it. But I mean, I see Germany and Spain, and I raise you Serbia against Cameroon. It was just as exciting. It was just as a high-intense, high-octane game as the other game was. So for me, I think Europe must cede a couple of spots for Africa and for maybe South America as well.
So that's not going to happen because the World Cup is a European tournament with a sprinkling of everybody else. This is their tournament. The truth of the matter is, it is a tournament. So that's not going to happen. What has been suggested by FIFA going forward is a bigger World Cup, which some people are not actually for. A bigger World Cup means more spots for Africa as well. In terms of like African teams getting more spots at the World Cup, I think if you had a situation whereby, maybe not this particular year, but like in years past, in editions past, where you've had a Mexico who have been regularly in the last 16 and then maybe making it to the quarters and not beyond that. I think you have a more credible argument that, well, we keep getting to the latter rounds, so what is the argument against giving us more teams? I think it would be a more credible argument, but at the same time, I wouldn't say that based on that you should not then just give the spots. It's not charity as well. I do think there is a consideration to be made that there's nowhere else in the world, I think you can make the argument, where football is played as much as the African continent. Because the furor around Qatar is obviously the human rights violations, but it's also the matter of it's not a footballing country or a footballing region, whereas you cannot say that about Africa. Like, the reason that you had to bring the World Cup here was that the reason that you want to populate the World Cup with more African teams would be the fact that there's so much of it played here. I'm saying, I think if there is any counter to that, is based on what I did see, like at AFCON, for example, because I make the argument for Nigeria, but they were unimpressive at that AFCON, even with their players. And I wonder, like, if they were here, would they be making the kind of noise that the teams who beat teams like Nigeria to get there are making? Because they are credible. That's why they're here. They are the strongest that Africa has, and that is why they're doing as well, relatively speaking, as they are. And something about enlarging a pool is that you actually stand the chance of weakening the tournament itself. That is also the argument in terms of what you see with the Champions League. Every season you get these teams where you know that they're just going to be battered. That's not good for football. That's not good football. That's not good for football. And where I suppose that maybe on the fence is the question that if you say you open up 5 other spots, along with a Nigeria or an Egypt, the 3 other teams that would be there, I don't agree with you in terms of like South Africa would be making noise at this World Cup. I don't believe that.
I don't think
based on how good or not good they are. And the question is, those teams around like Bafana, would they just be there to be making up numbers? Maybe to begin with, but as we see in this edition, going forward, you do want to give that chance because it only bodes well for teams when they get to compete and they have the chance to compete at the highest level.
So what I said is that I was just counting the route Ghana and the opposition that they went through to get there, that South Africa was one of the eligible teams to go through via that Ghana brackets to the World Cup. But I said also, which I don't think they're like the 3rd strongest of those who missed out. But Jay, it's not a charity, I do agree. But in terms of it being a global game, do you not want want to then have global appeal and include global countries? Because I think largely most of us would say that the Prem, maybe La Liga, the Champions League is of higher quality than the World Cup. That part we understand. But how much more would you be watering it down by adding, like we're saying, you're not adding Lesotho or Swaziland, who are not the highest in Africa. You're adding the top competitors like Egypt, who made it into the final, a Nigerian team who barely missed out. You're adding credible team to that number. We're not just doing it for the sake of adding numbers, but teams that we think can compete. Teams who have players playing abroad in Europe and in other places where there is good quality football. I'm just saying, if you lean it towards Europe, it will always be. I mean, the last 2 winners, it's France and Germany, if I'm not mistaken, right? That is Europe, and for me, that has shown the surge or the growth in the quality of European football. It reflects in the World Cup. But then if FIFA want to also grow the game globally, and they never ever give us the spot to shine on the big stage, which is FIFA's showpiece. I mean, we never, to be honest, FIFA might be doing 100 other things, but we never get to see what FIFA are doing unless the World Cup is on. No one cares or sees what FIFA is doing unless the World Cup is on. This is when they say we are building Qatar football. This is when we're putting a FIFA footprint in Qatar. If you never put them at that showpiece, how are you building football as a global sport?
Well, I'm not against Africa getting more teams, and we are going to see Africa get more teams if I don't know if it has actually gone through, if the World Cup is made to be a bigger tournament, and it can only bode well for Africa and for the development of football on the continent. And with the amount of players who are playing at the highest level who do come from African countries, you think about your Burkina Fasos, you think about maybe even a Mali, you know. So you might get what you're saying in terms of you have even the teams who are on equal footing with the ones that we do have at the World Cup who missed out because it was a 2-game knockout, and sometimes that happens. You replay those games again, it might not be a Ghana who gets over Nigeria. It might be Nigeria in that case, or it might be Egypt. And rather than sacrificing one of the two, have both of them there and at that level of quality. So I'm not against it. And perhaps the Ghana coach does have a point in that.